The Act You Now Know The Act You Now Know end to end is, in a sense, a promise. It promises notices without saying what one looks like. It promises verifiable parental consent without saying how a parent gets verified. It promises reasonable security without naming a single safeguard. It promises breach intimation without a clock, retention limits without a number, a digital board without a procedure. For 2 years, Indian compliance lived with those promises and argued about their meaning. Then, in November 2025, the government published the document that caches them, the Digital Personal Data Protection Rules. Welcome to Arc 3, the rules. The Act told you what the law demands. Over the next 15 episodes, the rules tell you what Monday morning looks like. Today, the aerial view before we descend. You're listening to DPDP Daily. I'm Harmeet Singh Kapoor. I've spent my career running large programs and portfolios, the discipline of making complex things actually happen. And for the past few years, I've brought that discipline to India's data protection law. I wrote the DPDP Act Compliance Handbook from Law to Ground Reality, and this show is that book, opened up one episode at a time. If you're new here, the 30-second background. In 2023, India passed its first comprehensive data protection law, the Digital Personal Data Protection Act. In November 2025, the government notified the rules that make it operational on a phased clock that runs to full enforcement in May 2027. Together, they decide what every company, hospital, school, app, and shopkeeper in this country may do with your personal data and what you can demand when they get it wrong. 15 minutes a day, no jargon, real answers. Let's get into it. Start with a craft lesson this arc depends on. How to read delegated legislation, because rules are a different literary form from acts. An act sets architecture and survives decades. Rules carry machinery and expect maintenance. 3 reading disciplines follow. First, always read a rule with its parent section open beside it. A rule's meaning is bounded by the power that made it, which is why our Act arc came first, and why I'll cross-reference it constantly. Second, watch the schedules. The rules pack their most concrete obligations into schedules and standards, the way the first schedule carried the consent manager conditions we read in episode 1. The fine print is the print. Third, expect motion. Rules amend faster than acts, and this framework has already shown its habit of corrigenda and phased commencement. The 4-channel regulatory watch from our earlier episodes is, in this arc, simply professional hygiene. Now the aerial tour, what the rules actually deliver, organized the way this arc will walk them. First, the citizen-facing machinery. The notice standard, the Act's Section 5 promise becomes Rule 3's specification, standalone, itemized, plain language, understandable independently, and tomorrow's episode turns it into a drafting workshop where we build a compliant notice line by line. The consent ecosystem, Rule 4, and the first schedule construct the consent manager institution end to end, registration conditions, obligations, suspension machinery, and because this November's registration opening makes it the most time-sensitive material in the arc, it gets 2 full episodes, deeper than our series opener went. Second, the protection machinery. Rule 6 finally names names on security. The Act said reasonable safeguards and left boardrooms guessing. The rule specifies a flow, encryption and its cousins, access control, logging and monitoring, backups, contractual flow down to processors, and episode 35 maps that flow onto a real security program. Rule 7 builds the breach procedure, what affected individuals must be told and how fast, and the board's 2-stage intimation with the 72-hour detailed report. Episode 36 drafts those templates before you need them and reconciles the certain parallel track this series has flagged since its earliest days. Third, the life cycle machinery, the retention architecture, the Act's purpose no longer served gets the third schedule's hard numbers for notified classes, the 3-year sweep, the 48-hour warning, plus the log retention requirements that quietly contradict lazy deletion rhetoric, an episode of its own, the publication duties, the contact person every fiduciary must display, small rule, universal applicability, forgotten constantly. Fourth, the special category machinery. Children. Rules 10 and 11 turn verifiable parental consent into actual verification rails. The identity detail route, the virtual token route, the guardian provisions for persons with disabilities, with Rule 12's bounded exemptions for schools, healthcare, and childcare. We covered the law in the children's episodes, and the rules episode goes into the mechanics and implementer needs. The SDF operational layer, Rule 13's annual cadence for impact assessments and audits, and the algorithmic due diligence expectations, operationalizing the pyramid top obligations from episode 25. Fifth, the rights and remedy machinery. Rule 14 and its neighbors, how rights requests actually travel, the published means, the identifiers, the grievance clock, the nominee mechanics, turning the four rights of episode 26 into workflows, and the board's own procedural rules, how the digital office conducts itself, the machinery behind everything episode 11 described. And sixth, this matters for honesty, what the rules deliberately do not finish. The consent manager technical standards await board publication as we've tracked since episode 1. The SDF designations await notification. Various forms, particulars, and platform specifications sit with the board's website rather than the Gazette. The rules complete the Act's promises the way a building completes a blueprint, with some rooms explicitly labeled fit out pending. Part of this ARC's job is marking exactly which rooms, so you're never surprised by an unfurnished one. A word on how this ARC treats ground we've already walked, so expectations are set. Several rules ARC subjects, the notice, the consent manager, children's mechanics, have appeared in earlier episodes because this show follows relevance, not just sequence. The ARC's promise is depth over repetition. Where an earlier episode gave you the law, the rules episode gives you the build, the workshop, the application file, the template. If you've been with the show from episode 1, you'll hear the layers stack rather than repeat. If you're joining here, each episode still stands alone with pointers back for the fuller frame. And one proof of the expect motion discipline worth citing, this framework has already produced a corrigendum to the rules within months of notification. Small corrections, but a live demonstration that delegated legislation breathes. The version you comply with is the version as amended, which is why the regulatory watch names a person and a cadence, rather than trusting memory. Let me close the aerial view with the strategic reframe that should govern how you consume the next 15 episodes. The Act arc built understanding. This arc builds artifacts. Nearly every episode ahead ends in something you can hold. A notice you could deploy, a breach template you could file, a security checklist you could evidence, a retention schedule you could implement, a rights workflow you could run, which means the right way to listen is with your own organization's gaps open beside you, the self-assessment scores from episode 13, the countdown plan from episode 2, because this arc is where those ambers and reds get their fixes, one rule at a time. The Act told you where you stand. The rules are how you move. Tomorrow, we descend to street level and start building. Rule 3, the notice, drafted live, line by line, for a business you'll recognize, with every itemization, language, and placement decision made out loud. Bring a pen, better yet, bring your own current notice, and prepare to be a little embarrassed by it. That's today's episode of DPDP Daily. If it made this law a little clearer, do one thing for me, send it to one person who needs it. That's how this show grows. Everything I covered today, with the templates, checklists, and audit frameworks behind it, is in my book, the DPDP Act Compliance Handbook, From Law to Ground Reality. And I post one practical DPDP insight every morning. Find me on LinkedIn and on X and Facebook as well, under Hamid S. Kapoor. One important note: this is education, not legal advice. For decisions about your organization or your rights, take proper professional advice on your specific facts. New episode every day. I'll see you tomorrow.